Let me tell you how we ended up in that house. A seemingly perfect house that became the epicenter of chaos for my family. We had been looking for a place for months, somewhere safe, clean, and big enough for Sarah, the kids, and me to grow into. You know, the kind of home where you could host backyard BBQs, see your kids run around without tripping over furniture, and just feel like you finally made it. When we found this place, it seemed too good to be true. And, as I later learned, that's because it was. It all started with the landlord, Mr. Grayson, a tall, broad-shouldered man with the kind of confidence that fills up a room before he even speaks. He wasn't just a landlord. He was the landlord, charismatic, smooth-talking, and, frankly, a little too involved in our business. On the day we signed the lease, he greeted us at the door like an old friend. His handshake was firm, his smile wide, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. Something smug, predatory even. I ignored it. After all, what landlord doesn't like to show off their property? This is your new kingdom, he declared as he led us inside. A place fit for a man like you, Michael, and your beautiful family. The way he said beautiful family made me glance at Sarah, who smiled politely but shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't a big deal, or so I told myself. The house itself was perfect, or close enough. 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a backyard that practically begged for a swing set. The kids, Emma and Liam, were ecstatic, running from room to room, shouting about who would get which one. Sarah loved the natural light pouring through the windows, and I loved the idea of finally having a quiet corner to call my office. It all seemed like a fresh start for us. Grayson's terms were reasonable, too. No ridiculous upfront costs, just a simple lease agreement and a handshake. You take care of my house, and I'll take care of you, he said with a grin that showed too many teeth. I should have paid attention to the way his eyes lingered on Sarah as he spoke, but I didn't. At first, things were fine. Grayson popped by occasionally to check on the property. I figured he was just being thorough. What landlord wouldn't want to keep tabs on their investment? But his visits started to get more frequent, and his reasons more flimsy. Just making sure the gutters are clean, he'd say one day. Thought I'd drop by with some fertilizer for the lawn, he'd claim the next. Always unannounced. Always with that damn grin plastered on his face. I tried to brush it off. He's just eccentric, I told Sarah. Probably lonely or bored. But I could see that it bothered her, too, even if she tried to hide it. Sometimes, when Grayson showed up, she'd find an excuse to leave the room or busy herself in the kitchen. Emma and Liam, thankfully, thought nothing of it. To them, Grayson was just the funny landlord who gave them candy and called them little champions. Still, something about him gnawed at me. Maybe it was the way he always seemed to position himself between Sarah and me during conversations, like he was trying to assert some unspoken dominance. Or maybe it was the way his compliments towards Sarah were just a little too personal. You're lucky, Michael, he said once. Not every man gets a wife this stunning. And with 2 kids? She doesn't look it. He chuckled as if it was a joke, but I didn't laugh. Looking back, I should have acted sooner, should have trusted my gut, but I didn't. I let him keep coming around, let him keep inserting himself into our lives. Because that's what men like him do. They test boundaries, inch by inch, until you're too deep to realize you've lost control of the situation. But trust me when I say this, Grayson underestimated me. And when the time came, I showed him exactly what happens when you push a man too far. You know, they say intuition is a powerful thing. And for a man who prides himself on being rational, I'd like to think I've got a decent gut instinct. But let me tell you, nothing could have prepared me for what I stumbled upon that day. It wasn't like I was snooping around or playing detective. I was just trying to help Sarah with some mundane chore. Yet, what I found turned my world upside down. It started innocently enough. Sarah was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, while I was in the living room helping Emma and Liam with their homework. The evening had that peaceful hum of family life. The clinking of pots, the scratching of pencils against paper, and the occasional burst of laughter from the kids. Then Sarah called out, "Michael, can you grab my phone from the bedroom? I think I left it on the nightstand." Simple request, right? So I went. Her phone was exactly where she said it would be, but as I picked it up, the screen lit up with a notification. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except the preview message was strange. Can't stop thinking about last time. When can we talk again? My heart skipped a beat. The message was from an unsaved number, and for a moment, I stood there frozen, staring at the screen like it might explode. Last time? What was this about? I told myself it could be innocent, maybe a coworker or a friend. But then why wouldn't the number be saved? And why did it sound so intimate? I'm not proud of what I did next, but if you were in my shoes, you'd understand. I unlocked the phone. Yes, I know. Privacy, trust, all that. But let me tell you something. Trust isn't blind. It's earned, and sometimes it's tested. The messages were unsettling, to say the least. They weren't overtly romantic or explicit, but the tone was unmistakable. The texts went back weeks, and the sender, whoever they were, had an air of familiarity that sent a chill down my spine. You looked stunning today. Wish I could have stayed longer. Don't forget our little secret winking faced. Let me know when he's out of the house. That last one? That was the one that nearly made me drop the phone. Who was he? Me? What secret were they talking about? My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the messages, piecing together a narrative I didn't want to believe. The sender wasn't just anyone. It was Grayson. The tone, the phrasing, even the little hints about his visits, it all pointed to him. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My first thought was to storm into the kitchen, confront Sarah, and demand answers. But something held me back. Anger, sure, but also doubt. What if I misunderstood? What if this was some elaborate scam or a misunderstanding? I needed to be sure before I blew everything up. I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it and walked back to the living room, trying to act normal. The kids were still working on their homework, and Sarah was humming a tune in the kitchen like nothing had happened. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. Every interaction, every word she'd exchanged with Grayson, every awkward laugh or lingering glance, they all took on a new, sinister meaning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Grayson in my mind. The way he'd complimented Sarah, the way he always found an excuse to drop by when I wasn't around. Was this what had been going on all along? And if so, how long had it been happening? I decided then and there that I needed answers. But more importantly, I needed proof. If there was even the slightest chance that Grayson was crossing a line, or worse, that Sarah was letting him, I wasn't going to sit back and let it happen. So, I started planning. Not some grand revenge scheme. Not yet. Just a way to confirm my suspicions. I needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. And trust me, the truth was far worse than I could have imagined. You know, there's a moment in every man's life where he realizes that the best way to fight back isn't with fists, it's with patience. I wasn't about to throw accusations around without evidence, not when it could risk my marriage or traumatize my kids. But I also wasn't going to sit idly by while this so-called alpha landlord played games in my house. So, I did what any man would do when his back's against the wall. I set a trap. The plan was simple, really. Grayson had a pattern. He loved to show up unannounced when he thought I wasn't home. Just doing my landlord duties, he'd say, flashing that smug grin of his. So, I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. A seemingly empty house. That Friday, I told Sarah I'd be heading out of town for work. It wasn't entirely unusual. My job occasionally required overnight trips, and Grayson must have caught on to that pattern too. I kissed Sarah goodbye, gave Emma and Liam hugs, and drove off around the block. I parked my car a few streets away, making sure it was out of sight, and then doubled back to the house on foot. I'd already installed a few hidden cameras in strategic spots around the house earlier that week, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one in our bedroom. It wasn't hard. Grayson had given me the excuse I needed by claiming the house needed wiring upgrades. I told Sarah I'd handle it myself, and she didn't question it. Little did she know, I wasn't upgrading anything. I was preparing for battle. From my vantage point in the neighbor's yard, I waited. The hours dragged by, and I started to wonder if I'd miscalculated. Maybe Grayson wouldn't take the bait. But just as the sun began to set, there he was. His sleek black car pulled up in front of the house, and my blood boiled as I watched him casually walk up the driveway like he owned the place. He knocked on the door, and when Sarah answered, I could hear their voices faintly through the open window. Michael's out of town, isn't he? Grayson asked, his tone dripping with faux innocence. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but is something wrong with the house? She asked, clearly uncomfortable. Oh, nothing serious, he said. I just thought I'd stop by to check on things. You know, make sure everything's running smoothly while your husband's away. I clenched my fists as I watched him step inside, uninvited. Sarah didn't push back, though she seemed nervous. Was it fear? Guilt? I couldn't tell, but I could see the way Grayson carried himself, the way he leaned just a little too close to her, the way his hand brushed her arm as they walked into the living room. It was enough to make my stomach churn. From my phone, I pulled up the live feed from the cameras. I could see everything. Grayson was sitting on the couch, laughing too loudly at whatever Sarah said, his posture overly familiar. Sarah stood a few feet away, arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable, but not saying much to stop him. My heart pounded as I watched him inch closer, his hand moving to rest on the back of the couch, dangerously close to her shoulder. Relax, Sarah, he said, his voice smooth and low. You look tense. You work so hard, taking care of the kids, the house. You deserve a break. I wanted to storm in right then and there, to grab him by the collar and throw him out of my house. But I held back. I needed more. I needed him to cross that line completely so there'd be no doubt, no excuses. And then it happened. Grayson leaned in, his hand reaching out to touch Sarah's cheek. You're too beautiful to be stressed like this, he murmured. Sarah flinched, taking a step back. I think you should go, she said, her voice shaky but firm. But Grayson didn't move. Instead, he stood up, towering over her. Come on, Sarah, he said, his tone turning darker. Don't pretend you haven't thought about it. I know you felt the tension between us. Your husband doesn't have to know. That was it. The line wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. I bolted from my hiding spot, my blood roaring in my ears. I didn't care about the plan anymore. Grayson had made his move, and now it was my turn. The moment I barged into the house, Grayson froze mid-sentence, his smug expression replaced by one of utter shock. He clearly hadn't expected to see me there, especially not standing in the doorway like a bull ready to charge. I didn't say anything at first. Words seemed too small, too insignificant for the rage boiling inside me. I just stood there, glaring at him, daring him to make his next move. Michael, Sarah gasped, her face a mixture of relief and terror. She stepped back, putting some distance between herself and Grayson. I could see the fear in her eyes, but I wasn't sure if it was because of Grayson or because of me. Grayson, to his credit, or stupidity, tried to recover. He smoothed down his shirt and forced a grin, the kind of grin a man wears when he thinks he's still in control. Michael, back so soon? I was just checking in with Sarah about the house. About the house? I repeated, my voice low, calm, too calm. It was the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. Funny, because from where I was standing, it looked like you were checking in on something else entirely. He raised his hands in mock surrender, that infuriating smirk still plastered on his face. Now, let's not jump to conclusions. You were just what, Grayson? I cut him off, taking a step closer. Because from what I saw, and I saw everything, you were about 2 seconds away from crossing a line that no man has the right to cross. His smirk faltered for a moment, but then it was back, more defiant than ever. Listen, Michael, you're overreacting. I think you misunderstood. Misunderstood? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You think I misunderstood the way you've been sniffing around my wife for months? The way you've been using this landlord excuse to worm your way into our lives? Or maybe I misunderstood the text messages on her phone. Which one is it, Grayson? That wiped the smirk off his face. He glanced at Sarah, whose face turned pale. You went through my phone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I had to, Sarah, I said, still keeping my eyes locked on Grayson. Because you didn't tell me what was going on. You let this snake slither into our home, and I had to find out the hard way. Grayson decided to double down, shrugging like none of this was a big deal. Look, maybe I got a little too friendly, but that's no reason to blow things out of proportion. You've got a great wife, Michael. I was just appreciating her. Appreciating her? I repeated, my voice rising. You think invading my home, disrespecting my marriage, and making my wife uncomfortable is appreciation? By now, the kids had crept out of their rooms, drawn by the commotion. Emma and Liam stood at the top of the stairs, their wide eyes darting between me and Grayson. Sarah noticed them too, and her voice wavered as she said, Michael, please. Not in front of the kids. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let Grayson walk out of here thinking he'd won, thinking he could do this to my family, or worse, to someone else's family. You want to play the alpha, Grayson? I said, my voice sharp and cold. Then let's see how well you handle it when someone fights back. I stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He tried to backpedal, raising his hands as if to ward me off. Hey, let's not do anything we'll regret, all right? We can talk this out. But there was no talking, not anymore. My patience had run dry, my restraint gone. Grayson had made himself at home in my house for far too long, and now he was going to face the consequences. Get out of my house, I said, my voice low and deadly, and if you ever come near my family again, I swear, you'll regret it. He hesitated for a moment, like he was weighing his options. Then, in a last-ditch effort to save face, he smirked again and muttered, You're not as intimidating as you think, Michael. That was the breaking point. Before I even realized what I was doing, my fist connected with his jaw. The sound was loud enough to make Sarah and the kids gasp. Grayson stumbled back, clutching his face, and I stood over him, breathing heavily. Leave, I growled. Now. Grayson scrambled to his feet, muttering curses under his breath as he stumbled out the door. I stood there for a moment, shaking with adrenaline, as Sarah and the kids stared at me in stunned silence. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Grayson had crossed a line, and now it was my turn to make sure he'd never forget it. I thought I'd seen the worst of Grayson. I thought a man like him, after being humiliated and kicked out of my house, would cut his losses and disappear. But Grayson wasn't just arrogant. He was delusional. And when a man like that feels cornered, he does something reckless. Something unthinkable. It happened the very next evening. We were sitting down for dinner. Sarah, the kids, and me, trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. The tension from the previous night still lingered in the air, but I was doing my best to act as if everything was fine. Sarah was quieter than usual. Emma and Liam were chatting about their school projects, and I was halfway through a bite of Sarah's chicken casserole when there was a knock at the door. My stomach tightened. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Sarah glanced at me, her expression wary, and I told the kids to stay seated as I got up to answer it. But before I even reached the door, I heard his voice. Michael, open up, man. Let's talk. Grayson, the nerve of this guy. I opened the door just enough to see him standing there, looking far too confident for someone who'd been thrown out of my house the night before. His jaw was slightly swollen, my handiwork, but he didn't seem the least bit intimidated. What do you want? I asked, my voice cold. I didn't open the door any further. The last thing I wanted was for him to step foot inside again. Grayson smirked, leaning casually against the doorframe like he owned the place. I figured we should clear the air. You overreacted yesterday, but I'm willing to let it slide. We're adults, right? No need for all this hostility. Hostility? The man had tried to touch my wife in my own house, and he thought I was being hostile? Grayson, you're lucky I didn't call the cops last night, I said through gritted teeth. You crossed a line, and as far as I'm concerned, we have nothing to talk about. Leave before I make you regret coming here. But instead of leaving, Grayson pushed harder. His smirk widened, and he lowered his voice, just loud enough for me to hear. You've got a lot to lose, Michael. This house? Your happy little family? Wouldn't want to jeopardize that, would you? I stepped closer, my fists clenching. Is that a threat? Not a threat, he said, shrugging. Just a reminder. I've got connections. I could make things very uncomfortable for you. Eviction notices, sudden inspections, skyrocketing rent, you name it. All I'm asking is a little cooperation. It was all I could do not to punch him again, but But I knew that's what he wanted. He wanted me to lose control so he could play the victim. So instead, I took a deep breath and said, "You're not welcome here. If you don't leave now, I will call the police." Grayson laughed, a deep, mocking sound that set my blood boiling. And then, as if to prove just how far his arrogance could go, he leaned forward and called into the house, "Sarah, come out here, sweetheart. Let's talk like adults." That was it. I shoved the door open, forcing him to stumble back. "Don't you dare speak to her," I growled. "You don't talk to my wife, you don't come near my family, and you sure as hell don't step foot on my property again." But Grayson didn't back down. Instead, he squared his shoulders and looked me dead in the eye. "What are you going to do, Michael? You're not an alpha. You're just a guy pretending to be in control. But me? I run this house. I'm the landlord. You're just a tenant." And then, as if to drive his point home, he did something I'll never forget. He took a step forward, raised his hand, and brushed it against my shoulder. Just lightly, but it was enough. Enough to send a clear message. I can do whatever I want. Behind me, I heard Sarah's voice. "Michael, don't," she said. Her tone panicked. But it was too late. The dam had burst. Grayson wasn't just a landlord anymore. He was a predator, a man who thought he could intimidate me in my own home, in front of my wife and kids, and I was done playing by his rules. The next few moments would change everything, but at that point, I didn't care about the consequences. Grayson had come into my life thinking he could play the alpha. It was time to show him what happens when you mess with a man who has everything to lose. "You think you can walk into my house, intimidate my family, and act like you own us?" I said, my voice cold and steady. My fists clenched at my sides, but I was holding back, for now. Grayson had no idea what was coming. "Own you?" he said with a chuckle, stepping closer. "Michael, let's be real. You're just a tenant. I make the rules here. Your wife knows it, and deep down, so do you." That was it. The final straw. Without thinking, I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him back against the wall. The sound of the impact echoed through the hallway, and I could hear Emma and Liam screaming upstairs. Sarah rushed forward, trying to pull me back, but I didn't budge. My hands were trembling with rage, but I wasn't letting go. "Let me tell you something, Grayson," I hissed through gritted teeth. "You might think you're the alpha, but in this house, you're nothing. Nothing but a predator who made the mistake of picking the wrong family to mess with." His bravado faltered for a split second, but then he laughed, a low, taunting sound that made my blood boil even more. "Go ahead, Michael," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What are you going to do? Hit me? In front of your kids?" Real, alpha behavior. I didn't care about his taunts anymore. My instincts took over, and before I could stop myself, my fist connected with his face. The force of the punch sent him stumbling to the floor, clutching his jaw. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and for a moment, he just stared up at me, stunned. "Michael!" Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm. "Stop. You're going to make this worse." But it was already too late. Grayson wasn't done yet. He scrambled to his feet, wiping the blood from his mouth, and sneered at me. "You think this is over? You think I'm scared of you? I'll ruin you, Michael. I'll ruin your life, your marriage, everything." That's when he made his biggest mistake. He turned his attention to Sarah, stepping toward her with a malicious glint in his eye. "And you," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You should have been smarter. You should have known better than to marry a coward." I didn't even think. My body moved on its own, fueled by a primal need to protect my family. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy decorative glass vase from the side table, and swung it. The impact was sickening, the sound of shattering glass mingling with Grayson's howl of pain. He fell to the ground, clutching his face, and that's when I saw it, blood streaming from his eye. Everything froze. The rage, the adrenaline. It all drained away in an instant, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. Grayson was writhing on the floor, cursing and groaning, his hand pressed tightly over his injured eye. Sarah stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth, while the kids' cries echoed from upstairs. For a moment, no one moved. The reality of what I'd done hit me like a freight train. I'd crossed a line, the same way Grayson had crossed his, and there was no going back now. "Michael!" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with shock. "What did you do?" Grayson's voice broke through the silence, raspy and filled with venom. "You're done," he spat, still clutching his face. "You're finished. I'll make sure you lose everything. Your job, your house, your family. You'll regret this for the rest of your life." But in that moment, I didn't care about his threats. All I cared about was the fact that my family was safe. He would never touch Sarah again, never intimidate us, never show his smug face in my house. Whatever happened next, I'd deal with it. But for now, Grayson had finally learned what happens when you push a man too far. I took a deep breath, staring down at the broken man on the floor, and said, "Get out of my house, and don't ever come back." He staggered to his feet, bloodied and defeated, and stumbled out the door without another word. As soon as he was gone, I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. My hands were still shaking, but it was over, for now. Or so I thought. My knuckles throbbed from the punch, and the sharp edge of regret began to creep in, mingling with the adrenaline that still coursed through my veins. Sarah stood frozen by the door, staring at the bloodstain on the floor where Grayson had fallen. Upstairs, the muffled sound of Emma and Liam crying reminded me of what was truly at stake. "Michael!" Sarah's voice broke the silence, trembling and barely audible. "What are we going to do?" I looked up at her, and for a moment, I didn't have an answer. What were we going to do? Grayson's threats weren't empty. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, and I just shattered the illusion of his dominance. He wouldn't let that slide. But then I looked at Sarah, the fear in her eyes, and I knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, I wouldn't let him win. "We'll handle it," I said firmly, though my voice didn't carry as much conviction as I'd hoped. "I'll make sure he doesn't come near us again." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Michael, he's dangerous. You saw what he's capable of. And now," she gestured to the bloodstain, "now, he has a reason to come after us." I stood up, ignoring the ache in my fists, and walked over to her. "Listen to me," I said, placing my hands gently on her shoulders. "I'm not going to let him hurt you or the kids. He can threaten all he wants, but I'll make sure we're safe." She nodded, but her expression was far from reassured. I couldn't blame her. This wasn't just a fight between two men. It was a storm that had been brewing for months, and now it had finally exploded. The fallout was going to be messy. The first order of business was calming the kids. I went upstairs to find Emma and Liam huddled together on Emma's bed, their faces streaked with tears. They looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes, and it broke my heart. "Daddy, is the bad man gone?" Liam asked, his voice small and shaky. "Yes, buddy," I said, kneeling down beside them. "He's gone, and he's not coming back. You're safe, okay? I promise." Emma sniffled, clutching her little brother tightly. "Are you and Mommy okay?" I forced a smile, though my chest felt heavy. "We're okay. Everything's going to be fine." It took some time, but I managed to get them back to bed. By the time I returned downstairs, Sarah had cleaned up the blood and was sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. I joined her, and for a while, neither of us said anything. The silence was oppressive, filled with unspoken fears and questions. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "What if he goes to the police?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "He might, but we have the footage from the cameras. It shows everything. How he came here, what he said, what he tried to do. If he tries to press charges, he'll incriminate himself." Sarah nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. "And if he doesn't go to the police? What if he tries to come back? Or worse, what if he uses his connections to make good on his threats?" That was the part one didn't have an answer for. Grayson had power, and he wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. But I wasn't about to let him hold that power over us anymore. "If he comes back, we'll deal with it," I said. "And if he tries to mess with us, we'll fight back. Legally, publicly, whatever it takes." It wasn't the reassurance she needed, but it was the best I could offer. The truth was, I didn't know what was going to happen next. I only knew that we couldn't let fear dictate our lives. That night, I stayed up, watching the camera footage over and over again, cataloging every moment, every word Grayson had said. I wasn't just preparing for his next move. I was preparing to strike back. Whatever game he thought he was playing, he had underestimated me. He thought I was just a tenant, a pushover, but he was about to learn that a man fighting for his family is capable of anything. The storm wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. But as I sat there, staring at the screen, I made a vow. No matter what Grayson threw at us, I would protect my family. And I wouldn't stop until he was out of our lives for good. The next few days, the kids were calmer, Sarah seemed less shaken, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt like ours again. But deep down, I knew it couldn't be that simple. Men like Grayson don't just walk away. I didn't have to wait long to find out I was right. The first sign came in the form of a letter. It arrived the next morning, slid under our door while we were eating breakfast. I picked it up, half expecting it to be some generic notice about maintenance or rent. Instead, it was a typed letter on expensive-looking stationery, and the words made my blood run cold. Michael, you've made a grave mistake. I'm giving you one chance to fix it. Withdraw your accusations and apologize, or I'll make sure you lose everything. Sincerely, your alpha landlord. The arrogance of it, the nerve to still call himself alpha after everything, was enough to make me want to tear the letter in half. But as I read it again, a chill settled over me. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. What is it? Sarah asked, her voice hesitant. She must have noticed the way my jaw tightened as I read. I handed her the letter without a word. Her face paled as she read it, and she looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. Michael, what does he mean by lose everything? I don't know, I admitted, though I had my suspicions. Grayson had always bragged about his connections, about how he had the ear of local officials and the backing of powerful friends. If he wanted to make our lives miserable, he had the resources to do it. But I wasn't about to let him win. I'll handle it, I said, trying to sound confident. He's bluffing. But Grayson wasn't bluffing. By the end of the week, I had my answer. It started with a knock on the door. This time, not Grayson, but a uniformed man with a clipboard. Michael? He asked, glancing at the name on his paperwork. Yes, I said warily. I'm with the county housing board. We've received a complaint about unsafe conditions on this property. I'll need to conduct an inspection. Sarah appeared behind me, her face tight with worry. Unsafe conditions? She echoed. That's ridiculous. This house is perfectly fine. I'm just following up on the complaint, the inspector said with a shrug. You'll need to comply, or the property could be condemned. Condemned? The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew exactly who was behind this, and I could see the smug satisfaction on Grayson's face in my mind as I let the inspector in. He spent the next 2 hours nitpicking every detail of the house. Loose screws, a chipped tile, minor wear and tear that anyone would overlook. By the time he left, he had a list of violations that made it clear this was no coincidence. As if that wasn't enough, the next blow came at work. My boss called me into his office, his expression grave. Michael, we've received some concerning reports about you, he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were photos, grainy but unmistakable, of me confronting Grayson, my fist mid-swing. These were sent anonymously, my boss continued. I don't know what's going on in your personal life, but this kind of behavior reflects poorly on the company. You're on probation until we can sort this out. I clenched my fists, barely able to contain my frustration. Grayson wasn't just targeting my home. He was targeting my livelihood. And he wasn't stopping there. That night, I sat down with Sarah, the weight of everything crushing down on me. He's trying to ruin us, I said. The housing board, my job. He's pulling every string he can to make our lives hell. What are we going to do? She asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. For the first time, I felt truly cornered. Grayson had resources, connections, and no moral compass. I had my family and my integrity, but in the face of his relentless attacks, it felt like a losing battle. But then Sarah said something that changed everything. What if we go public? Public? I repeated, frowning. Yes, she said, her voice gaining strength. If he's going to try to ruin us, we expose him for who he really is. You have the camera footage, right? Of what he tried to do to me. We show people the real Grayson, the predator, the manipulator. It was risky, but she was right. Grayson thrived on power and control, but what would happen if we took that away? If we turned the spotlight on him? For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. Grayson thought he was untouchable, but he'd underestimated one thing: a family willing to fight back. The decision to go public wasn't one I made lightly. I knew it was a gamble, but Grayson had left me no choice. He'd come after my home, my job, and my family. The only way to beat him was to expose him for what he truly was: a predator hiding behind power and arrogance. It was time to turn the tables. The first step was gathering evidence. I spent hours combing through the footage from the hidden cameras, making sure every damning second of Grayson's behavior was preserved. From his suggestive comments to Sarah to the physical confrontations, it was all there. Each clip painted a picture of a man who thought he was invincible, who believed he could manipulate and intimidate without consequence. But it wasn't just the footage. I began digging into Grayson's past, enlisting the help of a friend who worked in investigative journalism. What we uncovered was both shocking and infuriating. Grayson had a history of harassing tenants, using his position as a landlord to exploit vulnerable families. There were whispers of blackmail, accusations that had mysteriously disappeared, and a trail of complaints buried under legal jargon and settlements. He wasn't just a bad landlord. He was a serial abuser. With everything in place, Sarah and I decided to take the leap. We reached out to a local news station, sharing the footage and the details we'd uncovered. The reporters were horrified and immediately took an interest in the story. Within days, the segment aired, and our lives changed forever. The headline was damning: Alpha Landlord or Serial Predator? Local family speaks out against harassment. The footage played on every major channel in the area, and soon the story spread like wildfire. Grayson's smug face was plastered across screens, but this time, it wasn't under his control. People saw him for what he truly was: a bully, a manipulator, a coward. Victims from his past began coming forward, sharing their own stories of intimidation and abuse. One woman revealed how Grayson had threatened to evict her elderly mother unless she cooperated with his advances. Another family described how he'd sabotaged their rental agreement when they refused his demands. The public backlash was swift and unforgiving. Social media exploded with calls for justice, and Grayson became a pariah overnight. His so-called connections, the ones he'd boasted about, began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with his disgrace. The housing board launched an internal investigation, and my workplace, after seeing the evidence, rescinded my probation and issued a public apology. Grayson, of course, tried to fight back. He filed a lawsuit against us for defamation, but it didn't take long for the courts to see through his lies. The evidence was overwhelming, and with the mounting testimonies from other victims, his case fell apart. Instead of silencing us, he'd unwittingly amplified our voices. The final blow came when criminal charges were filed against him: harassment, blackmail, and attempted assault. His list of offenses grew by the day. The police raided his home, uncovering more evidence that only solidified his guilt. When he was finally arrested, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could breathe. But the victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to every family Grayson had ever hurt. At his trial, I sat in the courtroom with Sarah by my side, watching as victim after victim testified against him. Their courage was inspiring, and their stories were heartbreaking. When the judge handed down the guilty verdict, sentencing Grayson to years in prison, the room erupted in applause. Justice had been served. In the weeks that followed, life began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything we'd been through. The house, once a battleground, started to feel like home again. Emma and Liam laughed more, their fear gradually fading. Sarah and I grew closer, our bond strengthened by the ordeal. We'd faced the worst, and we'd come out stronger on the other side. One afternoon, as I was working in the backyard, Sarah came outside with a smile on her face. "You're not going to believe this," she said, holding up her phone. "The news station just called. They want to do a follow-up story, something about resilience and standing up to bullies." I laughed, shaking my head. "I think we've had enough headlines to last a lifetime." "Maybe," she said, leaning against the porch railing, "but I think it's important. People need to know they don't have to live in fear, that they can fight back." She was right, of course. If our story could inspire others to stand up against their own Graysons, then it was worth sharing. But more than that, it was a reminder of how far we'd come. From the moment Grayson had walked into our lives, he tried to tear us apart. But instead of breaking us, he'd brought us closer together. As the sun set over the backyard, I looked at Sarah, the kids playing in the distance, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Grayson might have thought he was the alpha, but he'd underestimated one simple truth: the strength of a family united. We weren't just survivors, we were a force to be reckoned with. Of course, there was one lingering thought in the back of my mind. Grayson was locked away, his power stripped, his reputation in tatters. But men like him don't just fade quietly into the background. As much as I wanted to believe it was over, a part of me knew he wasn't done. Still, for now, we had our lives back. Our home was ours again, free from his shadow. And no matter what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I'd do whatever it took to protect my family, because at the end of the day, that's what being a real alpha is all about.